Welcome to this video, which is about the parable known as the Prodigal Son. It's found in the Bible in Luke's Gospel, chapter 15, and it would be great if you had that open whilst we look at it. It's one of the most well-known of Jesus' parables. In this chapter, it's the last of three stories in a sequence. The Pharisees, the religious leaders, had been grumbling about the fact that Jesus was spending time with bad people. So Jesus tells three stories which make a related point, each about something that was lost and is found. In the first two, Jesus explains the story by talking about how God celebrates over one bad person who turns away from his or her sin. But this third story adds something more. In it, a rich man had two sons. The younger one is fed up with living at home. He asks his father to give him his inheritance now. That's a pretty offensive thing to ask for. Effectively, the younger son is saying, I can't wait for you to die. Especially in a culture in which older people are respected, the son's behaviour was shocking, and there would probably have been a sharp intake of breath from the listeners. But Dad seemingly takes it in his stride. He works out the accounts, probably has to reorganise the business, divides up everything and gives the younger son his share. The younger son leaves the family home and then blows the whole fortune on riotous living. Eventually the money runs out, and to support himself he ends up taking a job feeding pigs and living off their leftovers. For the people Jesus was talking to, pigs were not animals that someone should be around. This picture of the younger son is to show us just how desperate his situation is. At this point, Jesus says, the son comes to his senses and says to himself, even my father's servants are treated better than this. Maybe if I go back home and apologize, he'll take me on as a servant. So he heads home, but his father has been looking out for him and runs to meet him. Again, that's pretty shocking behavior. Seniors didn't run in that culture, and the idea that this man who had been insulted by his younger son should be so full of love for him that he should run to meet him was pretty scandalous. The son can't get through his prepared speech of apology before he's swept up in the love of his father. His dad gives him clean clothes and throws a party to celebrate his return. So far so good. Like the previous two stories, it looks like it's ending with a celebration over something that was lost but is now found. It's more shocking because we can see just how much the younger son would have hurt his father. But it's a story about how full of grace and love the father is for his son who was lost, right? Well, yes, but here comes a surprise. There's another person who is mentioned right at the beginning of the story, the older brother, and as this celebration gets underway, he is furious. He refuses to come into the house. More insulting behaviour from son to father. So his dad goes out to him to listen to why he's so angry. How can you just let your son off, the older brother asks. He can't even bring himself to acknowledge him as his brother. All this time I've been slaving for you. I've never stepped out of line, and you've never done anything for me like this. But this person has wasted your money and disgraced you, and you're welcoming him back with a feast. The older son's attitude to his father is no more appreciative and loving than the younger son was when he left. His attitude is basically, you owe me all this. It turns out that he is as alienated from the father as his brother. And Dad is just as gracious and patient with the older brother as he was with the younger. Look, he says, everything I have is yours. But your brother has come back to us. Can't you see how joyful I am about that? I want you to celebrate with me. And this is where the parable ends. We don't know whether the older son went in to welcome his younger brother back. The father's request to his older son is just left hanging. Why? Well, remember the context. The religious leaders were grumbling about the fact that Jesus was spending time with people they considered sinful. Their attitude was, these people are bad, they don't deserve God being interested in them. In reply, Jesus tells them about this older brother. These people are turning back to God, and God rejoices over that, as was pointed out in the other parables as well. The question is, are you, religious people, going to rejoice as people come to God? Or are you going to be like the older brother who doesn't see why anybody who hasn't worked as hard as he has should be accepted or loved by God? When I was growing up, I tended to think that the parable of the prodigal son was all about the younger brother being forgiven for wasting the inheritance. When we look at Luke 15, though, we see that the real point is not to do with that. Yes, the Father is gracious and forgiving, but the big challenge was to these religious people. Would they welcome sinners like God did, or not? They failed the challenge. In the rest of the gospel, we see that their rejection of this message was so strong, they were so offended by it, that they ended up putting Jesus to death. The challenge is still there, particularly for us people from a religious background. Of course, it's important to know that God is gracious and loving, and that if people come to their senses, he will forgive them. But the bigger question when we read this parable today is, as it was for the hearers then, what is our attitude to God's grace? Is there part of us thinking how much more we deserve good things from God than they do? Are we offended that people might be saved who don't deserve to be? And if that's the case, is it possible that we never really understood what God's grace meant at all? That's all for this video. If you want to explore this in more detail, Tim Keller's book on the parable called The Prodigal God is excellent and easy to read.